Top 10 waiver wire adds for week 13. Spoiler alert. On the surface, this seems like a very underwhelming week for waivers, and we don't have any buys, so naturally you might be thinking that this week is trash. I get it, but I challenge you. I challenge you to take a deeper look because there are some very interesting adds this week, some little hidden gems, if you will, and I do not use that phrase a lot. So let's dive into my top 10 waiver wire adds of the week and stick around. I've got some bonus tips at the end, some things that you should keep your eye on. You know, I could lead off this list with a mediocre running back, but I'm not giving into it. I am leading off my top 10 list with a guy that y'all have heard me talk about multiple times because I really do believe in him. Oh, I love it when one of our guys has a great day. Chimere Dike with 5 receptions on 7 targets for 44 yards and a touchdown. Oh, and he gave us a return touchdown as well. We talked about Chimere Dike in the stash video comparing him to Van Jefferson, and the clear preference was Dike, and he showed us exactly why, because he is the most talented receiver on the field for Tennessee. He is the wide receiver 1, and while it might make you a little uncomfortable to lean into a wide receiver from Tennessee, we do continue to see improvements from Cam Ward as the season goes on, and for our purposes, the Titans are clearly comfortable enough with letting him push volume, and that's all we need. Ward actually had a great game. 28 completions on 42 attempts for 256 yards and a touchdown to our boy Chimere Dike. Plus, Ward also got 1 on the ground. It was a good day for him. Despite losing the game, the Titans overall looked far more competent than usual. Iosivas was out with a hamstring injury. We know that those are often multi-week injuries. Calvin Ridley is done for the season. And quite frankly, even when Iosivas does return, they are just very extremely different receivers, just very different players. Dike brings a level of speed that Iosivas doesn't have. And when you have a subpar offense that needs to find a spark, you often turn to an electric player like Chimere Dike. Van Jefferson was not a factor. The Titans did elevate Xavier Restrepo, and he saw decent work. It was great, but it wasn't really a big factor there. I am very much so in on Chimere Dike rest of season. Well, look here. Another player from our waiver wire stash video. It is John Metchie. I was joking because it's funny to joke about the past production from Justin Fields. I do like him, but it is funny to joke. But I was joking, but actually I was being very, very serious there. Realistically, we were expecting to see about 200 passing yards from Tyrod Taylor. And that is a massive improvement on what Justin Fields was giving us. Literally 3 times the improvement or more on the production that Justin Fields was giving us outside of complete layup matchups. So naturally, we had to figure out where this uptick in pass volume was going to go. And a good chunk of it went to Bryce Hall. Fantastic. Yay. It was good to see because the checkdowns had come down recently. So again, really good to see. But the big winner in the receiving core was John Metchie. This is 2 weeks in a row now that Metchie has been the new featured wide receiver 1 for the Jets. The Jets traded for multiple receivers at the trade deadline, Adonai Mitchell and John Metchie. In the past 2 games, Metchie has clearly outperformed Mitchell. Mitchell has just 3 receptions on 13 targets in 2 games with the Jets. Now in week 11, Metchie had 3 receptions on 3 targets for 45 yards and a touchdown. This week, he had 6 receptions on 7 targets for 65 yards and a touchdown. Neither one of those games was a layup matchup. Week 11 was against New England. Week 12 was against Baltimore. Now we get an extremely soft stretch there for the Jets. Atlanta, Miami, Jacksonville. That's beautiful. As long as Taylor remains the starting quarterback, I am very much so on board with John Metchie. And again, we talked about this in the stash video. I am so happy for him because he was a solid prospect. This is not odd, this production he's having. His career was unfortunately derailed by his health. Now this could be his opportunity to finally be able to shine and be a featured receiver. I don't think he's going to waste it. I've been pretty transparent about my feelings regarding the Saints run game. It is ineffective in general. My confidence level in any running back in this offense is very low. The success that we saw from Alvin Kamara in week 10 against Carolina was literally just a function of Carolina's run defense having completely fallen apart. Checkdowns have been extremely limited. That has just really capped the overall ceiling for Alvin Kamara. But it was interesting that we did see an uptick in pass volume for Devin Neal. Why? I'm not entirely sure. But hey, it happens, so we have to take a look at it. Alvin Kamara went down with an injury. If the injury is serious, and we should know here over the next couple of days here, maybe you know by the time you watch this video, But the Saints are literally down to Devin Neal. He would receive the bulk of the work if he can retain this level of pass volume and have more success on the ground with very soft upcoming schedule in terms of Miami, Tampa Bay, and Carolina, and the Jets, and Tennessee to close out the season. Yeah, you know what? I can get on board. Just be cautious. Jayden Higgins has absolutely ascended to the clear wide receiver 2 role in Houston. We started to see a shift back in week 8 when Nico Collins was out. That game apparently opened up Houston's eyes for them to see him live in action as a lead receiver and say, hey, I don't know, I think this guy we drafted is pretty good. Maybe we should give him like some more snaps and some more targets. So since then, we got Nico Collins back and he's the clear wide receiver 1. We are not questioning that. This past week against Buffalo was a down week, but again, still the wide receiver 1. But the Texans, what we care about is the Texans have clearly minimized Xavier Hodginson's role since that week 8 game, and they have elevated Jayden Higgins' role. Now, there's not a massive separation in snaps because they do continue to use 5 receivers very frequently, but Hodgins saw just 36% of snaps and 0 targets in week 12. We were never looking for Higgins to take volume from Nico Collins. It was purely about overtaking Hodgins, and we have got enough evidence to say that has officially happened. We've talked about this in multiple videos. Trust the usage. 3 touchdowns in the past 5 games is for real. He has had between 9 and 15 fantasy points in 4 of the past 5 games, with the only down game being a terrible matchup against Denver. The Jags' pass game bounced back in week 12. Now, Trevor Lawrence was a hot mess. They were lucky to win that game, but he provided plenty of volume to supply all 3 of his primary pass catchers, Parker Washington, Jacoby Myers, and Brenton Strange, in his first game back from IR. The last time that we saw Brenton Strange in a full game was way back in week 4, and he picked up exactly where he left off. Now, Strange doesn't have a touchdown on the season, but where he has value in fantasy is the fact that he offers a very solid floor with a minimum of 9.9 fantasy points in all but 1 game that he's played in full this season. Strange had 5 receptions on 5 targets for 93 yards this week, and he has a very favorable schedule, with the exception of a Week 16 matchup against Denver. But actually, that's not a bad matchup for him. And quite frankly, the Denver matchup, it's geared more towards being difficult for receivers. It's perfectly fine for tight ends. Tight ends have fared very well against the Broncos this season. So actually, whereas Trevor Lawrence and the receivers technically have a poor rest of season schedule, it actually works out pretty well, perfectly, for Brenton Strange. Week 12 was a very underwhelming week for tight ends, with the exception of a big day from Hunter Henry. A reliable volume tight end is valuable right now, and Strange has borderline tight end 1 upside every single week, rest of season. Let's talk about another tight end here. This one's role is still a little bit split. It's not as dominating as Brenton Strange was, but Colston Loveland has continued to push forward over Cole Kmet. He is pushed to the point where he can be considered a weekly streaming option. Chicago's rest of season schedule is not friendly in general. They face Philadelphia, Green Bay, Cleveland, Green Bay again, and then a good matchup in week 17 against San Francisco. So we do have to be a bit cautious because this hot streak from Loveland has come against easier defensive matchups in Cincinnati. That is a super easy matchup. The Giants, Minnesota, Pittsburgh. But regardless of the fact that it is coming in good matchups, we can't ignore it. He's had between 7 and 30 fantasy points in the past 4 games, and it should be noted that that massive game did come against Cincinnati when Cole Kmet did get hurt, but at this point, again, they are clearly splitting snaps extremely evenly here. Loveland is running more routes. He is getting more targets. There seem to be multiple shifts that are happening for the Bears. We also have seen an increased usage in Luther Burden. We continue to see Kyle Monangai eating into DeAndre Swift's workload. The youth is ascending here in this offense, and I don't think it's a coincidence that all 3 rookies are on the rise. It's something that we have to pay attention to. Yes, another Jag here, Parker Washington. If he's on waivers, he is still very worth a roster. Looks like the game last week against the Chargers was just an outlier game in a tough defensive matchup. The Chargers have allowed the 2nd fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Washington became a consistent starter in week 7, and since then, he's had a minimum of 10 fantasy points in all but 1 game, the game against the Chargers. So perhaps he is solid, and that was just a bad matchup. Washington ran the same amount of routes and had the same amount of snaps essentially as Jakobi Meyers. Washington was slightly more productive with 5 receptions on 7 targets for 71 yards and a touchdown. Now, things will get more ambiguous when Brian Thomas Jr. returns, and that's why Washington is further back on the list, despite the fact that he has been so solid and feels very proven at this point. But he is worth an add to see how all of this plays out. This is a situation that is a little bit more difficult to predict because we're getting the exact same usage between Washington and Meyers right now. And unfortunately, for our purposes in terms of predicting it, both Washington and Meyers can play in the slot and outside. There is no clear role separation here. But it's not as if Brian Thomas Jr. was lighting it up here. It is entirely possible that Washington remains the most valuable fantasy producer in the receiving core, particularly in PPR. Andrei Iosivas got banged up in the game, but he did still end up running the most routes of any Bengals receiver and had a solid fantasy day, catching 4 of his 7 targets for 61 yards. Technically, he was outproduced from a fantasy perspective from Mitchell Tinsley, but Iosivas has been the more consistent wide receiver 3 for the Bengals, so we are giving him the edge in terms of streaming reliability and leaning into Iosivas for that because we thought this was just going to be a 1-week flex opportunity with the suspension to Ja'Marr Chase. But T. Higgins went down with a nasty concussion. It did not look good. And while it's possible that he does play, the Bengals are on a short week. They play on Thanksgiving, so the odds are not working in his favor here. That puts Andrei Iosivas back on the table in what theoretically should be a high-volume matchup between the Bengals and the Ravens. Chris Rodriguez doesn't offer you a ton of upside, but he does qualify as a lead back, so if you were dealing with injuries or perhaps you've been starting some of these backup running backs recently, like the guys from Tampa Bay or Arizona, and you're worried about the starters potentially returning this week and then you're out of a starting running back, you can turn to Rodriguez. Oddly enough, he does remain lower rostered than Ja'Cory Crosky-Merritt, despite the fact that Ja'Cory Crosky-Merritt has not had more than 5 fantasy points since way back in week 5, and Rodriguez has 3 touchdowns in his past 5 games, and he has had between 7 and 12 fantasy points in 4 of those past 5 games. Yeah, it seems like a no-brainer there, right? But apparently we're still struggling to get on board. That is technically because Washington, the backfield is a committee. It is what it is, right? Which means that the difference between Rodriguez's floor and his ceiling is kind of negligible. He's at the back of the list here because technically, in theory, he is the lead back. But again, it is a committee. And again, really, the rest of season schedule is kind of the big issue here. It's a mess. If you were looking at rest of season schedule rankings, it does look good, like on paper, on the surface, right? But it is very deceiving because a good chunk of the reason why it looks so good on paper is because they play Dallas. And we know that Dallas's defense is not the same defense now after they made all of the trades. Once they get to week 17, which is the week they play Dallas, that might actually not be an advantageous matchup as that defense starts to get a little bit more cohesive there with all of the improved starters that they've got there. So when you look at the rest of the season schedule, they have a matchup against Denver. You don't want to start Rodriguez in that matchup. You have a matchup against Minnesota, good matchup. Giants, good matchup. Followed up by Philadelphia, and then Dallas, we talked about. So it is a bit all over the place. But if you need to use him as a spot start, or perhaps you want to take a chance that Jayden Daniels comes back and breathes some life into this offense and provides some more goal line opportunities, you can look at Rodriguez. For disclosure, full disclosure, if you aren't actively needing to start Rodriguez, I would far rather roster any of the high-end handcuffs. Your Brian Robinsons, your Tyler Algier, Bashal Tootin, Ollie Gordon, Tank Bixby types, right? It's not even close. But if you need a lead-ish back that you can play right now, Rodriguez is on waivers. I wanted to include this one because it's something that you have to play by ear. Monitor the status for Marvin Harrison Jr. Because we talked about this on the waiver wire list. Well, technically speaking, he couldn't be a stash because, in theory, with what we have seen in terms of players returning from an appendectomy, Marvin Harrison Jr. should and could return this week. But in case he doesn't, perhaps he needs a little bit more time. Arizona is not super competitive, so maybe they want to be super cautious with him. If he doesn't play this week, Greg Dortch is absolutely on the table. He has had back-to-back weeks with a minimum of 16 fantasy points in PPR and a touchdown in each game and 6 receptions in each game. Jacoby Brissett provides such good volume that all the pass catchers are just having an excellent time with him at quarterback. And more than likely, they will be chasing points this week against Tampa Bay. So if Marvin Harrison Jr. can't go, Greg Dortch is a strong flex option here. And again, just a reminder, if you roster Michael Wilson and you're thinking of dropping him in anticipation of Marvin Harrison Jr. returning, don't do it. Don't do it. The volume here that we are getting from Brissett supports the wide receiver 3 being relevant, and that would be Michael Wilson. Now, a few things to keep your eyes on. Guys that didn't quite make it into the top 10 list for one reason or another. We'll break it down, but it is important to keep your eye on these players here. Now, Tez Johnson. Watch this one here. Godwin was limited. He was well under his typical snap count. We expected that. That was why I did not recommend him as a start. The Bucs were pretty clear about that. Still, though, we do need to acknowledge that Chris Godwin has not contributed at all this season. In games that he's played, he has barely had receptions. The production really hasn't been there. He doesn't look like himself. He is obviously coming off a significant injury that has adjusted his capabilities right now. Johnson, for that reason, might still be viable. Now, Baker Mayfield's injury does throw a wrench into it. Teddy Bridgewater isn't a complete nightmare, so we could continue to have some viability here. Just something to keep your eye on in deeper leagues there. Now, Christian Watson, he did not make this list because he is unfortunately too close rostered to 50% for me. I wanted to keep it, 50, below 50 clearly, or more so around 40 or lower here. Give some of the lower roster guys an opportunity to shine here, but if Christian Watson is on waivers, absolutely add him. And don't forget about Jayden Reed as well. Now, Isaiah Hodgins, 2 receptions on 6 targets, 42 yards, and a touchdown. This is kind of critical here. Something to keep your eye on here. Now, it might not be as valuable when Jackson Dart returns because obviously Jameis does air it out quite a bit more here. But it's critical because Isaiah Hodgins was on the field for the majority of snaps, equal to Darius Slayton, but he ran more routes than Slayton, and he had the more productive day. We know that he is very familiar with the Giants offense. The rapport there is clear. I talked about it before in terms of why this made me a little bit hesitant in terms of Slayton rest of season. We wanted to watch and see how this played out. And spoiler alert, it played out that Isaiah Hodgins might end up having more upside than Slayton. But we'll need to see when Dart comes back. Just keep your eye on it here. Now, this one, Keon Coleman. Keep your eye on it, okay? I know you don't want to, but here's the deal. Because he has been a healthy, disciplined scratch for multiple weeks in a row now here, people are dropping him to waivers. It is entirely possible that they have talked some sense into him and he has seen the light and he will come back apologetic and feeling bad and do his best out there and improve and be valuable rest of season. So it's not the worst stash in the world if you look on waivers and say, hey, look, I've got a deep bench. I've got, a spot to spare here. I can take a chance and see if the guy comes back, is active, and has seen the light somehow. Luther Burden is another guy that we need to keep our eye on here. We have seen him steadily ascending in this offense. It is tough to trust any Chicago wide receiver here. But when rookies are ascending, we pay attention. So Luther Burden is also a potential add as well. I would consider him right on the cusp. Arguably, I could have put him ahead of a couple other guys on the list here. But again, Chicago receiving core tends to be very hit or miss there. And then, as always, unfortunately, I did not include, I try not to include guys in the Monday night game just because you never know what might happen there. But keep your eye on Bryce Young and Xavier Legette. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel. You can also find me across all social media platforms at It's Steroid Time, so make sure that you are tuned in, locked in, subscribe, turn on notifications so you don't miss a video because we are closing out the fantasy season strong, and then also we are heading into the off season and talking about free agencies, rookies, NFL draft, all that good stuff. So make sure that you're subscribed and stick it around. Every single week I got you covered. Waiver wire content, stashes, trades, live shows with live Q&A, so much more. You can ask me anything.